there was a point in my career where like having that lens meant that I was a Canon pro. You wouldn't have a pro kit from Canon and not have the 51.2. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah. Yeah, I upgraded to this lens from the 50mm 1.4, and I upgraded because it was like shiny and it had the L thing on it.
And there's the allure, and everybody talks about it on the internet, about it being like one of the greatest lenses. And
yeah, you read all these,
you know?
you read all these forums on the internet, and it's all talking about like how this was the upgraded version of the 1.0, which is like this legendary lens from
that was like $5,000 in the 80s or 90s, whenever it came out. I don't know exactly, but it wasn't very practical, and nobody really bought it as like they did the newer version. So they came out with the 51.2 to make it a little bit less costly, and it got in the hands of more people, for sure.
There's a lot of mystique around this lens, and I think a lot of it is warranted. So you have a really nice rendering. It's not the sharpest thing in the world, but at 1.2, you know, back when in like 2006, you couldn't expect it to be like the sharpest thing ever.
Yeah, and I think like when it came out, a lot of cameras didn't have the kind of ISO that we're used to now. So like having 1.2 was really advantageous, not only from a stylistic perspective, but also from like an actual usability perspective.
Yeah, we were kind of coming out of the film days. This was released in like 2006, so you're coming out of the film days, and people are used to having these, you know, lenses that open up to 1.2 being like the most premium lenses and whatnot. So
yeah, so sense. Having a 1.2 lens was great, but it was still less expensive than the F1, so it got into the hands of more people. And I don't know, I've owned this lens and I've sold it to buy it again, to sell it, to buy it again, to just sell it again. Like I've owned this lens more times than I care to count. And there's a reason for it. It's fantastic. Like if you have the Canon DSLR, you really at some point will probably own this if you're a professional photographer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you don't own the 85mm 1.2, I would pretty much own this lens if I was shooting EF mount. So, I mean, it's really good. I mean, the pluses to it are just the bokeh and the rendering and the fact that you can tell everybody. Yeah, it's
that's
actually
something that
pretty
you don't
small
really
for
think
1.2.
about. Like it seems really big when you see it on the internet and stuff, but in the hands, it's really not that big. For the L lens, it's one of the smaller ones, actually.
Yeah, and it's because it still has a little bit of chromatic aberration, and some people will say that the chromatic aberration and having less elements adds to the character and their overall rendering of like portraits or something. So this is kind of like your classic Canon portrait lens, and there might not be a better one if you like shooting 50mm for portraits instead of 85.
Yeah, should we jump on the iPad and look at some pictures?
Yeah, let's do it.
I really like the colors that this lens reproduces, and I really like the star-shaped flares that are in here off the tower, and there's a couple more here along the bottom. I think it kind of adds to the look, especially if you're doing like a landscape and at night and stuff. Here, this kind of exemplifies like what you would mostly do with this lens if you were a portrait photographer. I feel like you would want to shoot it pretty much at the minimum focus distance and to get that nice kind of bokeh look. And I really like this image because my subject in this one was looking off into the distance in a way that's very alluring. It makes you wonder what she's looking at or what the interest is. I'm a big fan of this photo. This one here is another photo I did, more of a headshot, which is not something that you would normally do with a 50mm, but in this instance, it worked out. As you can see, the softness of it is severe. Like you can tell from her left eye to her right eye that the focus is actually shifted a little, and her left eye appears to be more out of focus than the right, which just goes to show you how much depth of field you really have at 1.2.
Yeah, so I shot all these at like f2. I found that this lens was not like that sharp at 1.2, and at the time I think I was a little bit too concerned with sharpness, but if you're shooting this, maybe shoot at like f1.2, be a little bit less concerned about chromatic aberration and stuff. The downfall of this lens is definitely just how much chromatic aberration it has, but you know, in this, if you're at f2, you stop down a little, then you can't see it at all if you're concerned about that. It's a preference thing, but yeah, nice depth of field there. I love the colors of this lens. Here's another one. You know, all my photography from this time is a little bit of a facepalm to me, but if I can stop focusing on my photos here and just look at like kind of like the character of the lens and stuff. It is pretty. It's not too sort of sharp, and it does have a nice rendering. Has lots of character. Some photographers will say that, you know, having less elements in a lens will actually make it better. There's a whole group of photographers online who like hate the Otis because they're like, oh, it takes out all the character and it is too sharp and stuff. So
Simple
You
as
never
nice,
know.
yeah.
Yeah, everybody kind of has their own thing. And then another face palm. I don't know why, like what.
I think that's a great photo.
Oh, thanks,
Yeah.
man. Yeah, I think looking back at your photography, sometimes it's kind of weird. I shot this like 6 years ago, but yeah, I mean, highly edited, but yeah, I really like the way that the skin's rendered and stuff. And this was probably at 1.8. I guess not quite at 1.2. I never really shot this lens at 1.2,
And
but
the bokeh on it's really nice. Like, it's not super round, and it looks really soft and creamy. I loved that.
yeah, I do love the
focus.
bokeh on this lens. I mean, compared to the 50mm 1.4, I'd say that the bokeh is way better.
Definitely one of its strengths, yeah.
Yeah, so if you're going to pay $1,000 more for this lens compared to the Canon 50mm 1.4, I mean, I think the biggest upside is the bokeh and the colors. But I mean,
yeah, and sometimes you just shoot it at 1.2. Like, if you're gonna have that lens, like, that's kind of the point. And like, sometimes some of the shots that I make with it aren't gonna be perfectly in focus, but sometimes those are the most popular pictures that people love the most because they emote a feeling.
yeah, exactly. And if you ever plan to use a film camera, like a Canon EF film camera, this is a great lens to put on there because you are obviously stuck at a certain ISO, and lots of film photographers will probably enjoy this lens too. I know I shot it on Portra 160 and Portra 400 a couple of times. It turned out really good too.
Yeah, so if you're looking for a 50 for your Canon DSLR, this is definitely the pinnacle.
Yep, a little bit pricey, but it might be worth it if that bokeh is worth it to you.